Professor Richard Vaughan believed humiliation was an excellent teaching tool, but on that cold October morning, he had no idea he was about to hand his own pride to a quiet woman in a gray cardigan. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The mathematics auditorium at Northbridge University buzzed with the polished confidence of people who were used to being the smartest in every room. Rows of graduate students adjusted laptops, compared notes, and spoke in low voices about algorithms, proofs, and internships worth 6 figures a year. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows and stretched across the polished wood floor like a spotlight waiting for someone important. Then Evelyn Carter stepped inside, and not one person believed that someone important had arrived. She wore a faded gray cardigan over a white blouse, practical flats, and carried a worn notebook tucked beneath one arm. At 38, she moved with calm restraint, the kind of posture that came from years of learning not to draw attention. Her light brown hair was tied back simply, and there was nothing about her appearance that matched the sharp suits and designer coats scattered through the hall. A few students glanced at her, then looked away with thin smiles. One young man leaned toward his friend and whispered loudly enough to be heard, probably lost on the way to the cleaning staff office. Soft laughter followed. Evelyn heard it. She gave no sign. She chose a seat in the back row, set her notebook on the desk, and folded her hands. On stage, Professor Vaughan arranged his papers with theatrical precision. At 56, he had built a reputation as one of the country's most celebrated theoretical mathematicians, and he wore that reputation the way some men wore medals. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly. His silver watch flashed under the lights. His expression suggested he had not been surprised in 20 years. He began speaking without introduction, and the room obeyed with instant silence. Today, he announced, we discuss elegant solutions versus amateur shortcuts. His voice carried the polished edge of someone who enjoyed being quoted. He paced slowly across the stage, writing symbols across the board in clean white strokes. Every movement seemed practiced. Every pause seemed designed. Evelyn watched carefully, her eyes following each line as if greeting old friends. Vaughan noticed her by the third equation. His gaze lingered a second too long. He had seen many outsiders attend his public lectures before, people curious enough to enter but unqualified to understand. Usually they sat quietly, took a few confused notes, and disappeared. Something about the woman in the back row unsettled him. She was not pretending to understand. She was checking him. A student near the aisle raised his hand and praised the complexity of the proof. Vaughan accepted the compliment with a nod that looked suspiciously like gratitude to himself. Then he turned back to the board and wrote a final equation larger than the rest. The chalk clicked sharply as he underlined it. This, he said, is considered impossible to simplify elegantly under standard constraints. Several students straightened in their seats. Phones lifted discreetly to capture the board. Vaughan smiled. He loved this part. The legend. The challenge. The room full of witnesses. In the back row, Evelyn Carter opened her notebook for the first time, uncapped a pen, and quietly wrote one sentence. The man beside her glanced over, then frowned. She had written only 4 words. There is a faster way. The student beside Evelyn stared at the sentence in her notebook, then let out a short laugh he did not bother to hide. A faster way, he repeated under his breath, nudging the woman next to him. She glanced over, read the words, and smiled with the easy cruelty of people who had never been underestimated themselves. Within seconds, the whisper traveled across the back rows like a breeze through dry leaves. Someone snickered. Someone else turned around to get a better look at the woman in the cardigan who apparently believed she had solved what experts debated for years. On stage, Professor Vaughan heard the movement and paused. He had spent decades controlling rooms like this. He could sense distraction the way musicians sensed a note out of tune. His eyes narrowed toward the back. Is there something worth sharing with the class? He asked. The hall fell still at once. The young man beside Evelyn straightened immediately. No, sir. Vaughan remained silent for a beat, then stepped forward. If there is commentary on advanced mathematics happening in the last row, I would hate for the rest of us to miss it. More restrained laughter rolled through the room. The student pointed, eager to redirect attention away from himself. It was her, Professor. She wrote that there is a faster way. Heads turned again. 100 faces searching for entertainment found Evelyn Carter sitting quietly with one hand resting on her notebook. Vaughn descended from the stage steps with deliberate calm. He approached the back row as if inspecting a minor disturbance. "May I see that?" he said. Evelyn handed him the notebook without resistance. He read the sentence, then smiled thinly. "There is a faster way." He repeated the words slowly, letting them hang in the air. "How refreshing. We have innovation in the audience today." Several students laughed harder now, relieved they had been given permission. Vaughn held the notebook between two fingers as though it were a curious object. "And your name is?" "Evelyn Carter." "Your department?" "I am not part of a department." Another ripple of amusement moved through the room. Vaughn tilted his head. "Not part of a department. Then what exactly qualifies you to critique work that occupies doctoral candidates and published researchers?" Evelyn met his gaze without hostility. "I did not critique it. I only said there may be a shorter path." A hush fell. Her tone had not risen. It had not trembled. It had simply refused to bend. Vaughn handed back the notebook. "Confidence without credentials is a dangerous modern trend," he said, turning so the room could enjoy the line with him. Then he added, "Perhaps today can become educational for everyone." He returned to the stage and gestured toward the board. "Miss Carter, since you seem to see what others miss, would you care to demonstrate this shorter path?" The invitation was polished, but everyone recognized the trap. Students shifted in their seats, some grinning openly now. A few lifted phones again, sensing a moment worth saving. Evelyn remained seated for a second, her fingers resting on the worn cover of her notebook. The lights above hummed softly. Chalk dust floated through the beam near the board. Vaughn clasped his hands behind his back and waited with the patience of a man certain of the outcome. "If you prefer not to," he added, "no one would blame you." That line drew the loudest laughter yet. Evelyn stood. The sound died almost instantly. She smoothed the front of her cardigan, stepped into the aisle, and began walking toward the stage with quiet, measured steps. Each heel tap against the wood floor echoed farther than it should have. Vaughn offered her a piece of chalk with a smile sharpened by pride. "Take your time," he said. Evelyn accepted the chalk, turned to the impossible equation, and for the first time that morning, Professor Vaughn noticed something deeply unfamiliar in the room. He was no longer the only person who looked certain. Evelyn stood before the board as if she had been there many times before, though no one in the room could imagine when. The equation stretched across 6 feet of polished black slate, dense with symbols, substitutions, and nested constraints that had intimidated graduate students for months. Professor Vaughn stepped aside with the graciousness of a host certain his guest would embarrass herself. The audience leaned forward in collective anticipation. Some smiled openly. Others prepared to enjoy the lesson that confidence without status usually ended badly. Evelyn did not write immediately. She studied the problem in silence, eyes moving left to right, then back again. Her gaze was calm, almost gentle, as though she were reading something familiar rather than facing a mathematical monument. Vaughn checked the large digital clock mounted above the auditorium doors. The red numbers glowed, clearly for everyone to see. "Let us begin," he said. A few students chuckled. Evelyn lifted the chalk. The room quieted enough to hear the faint scrape of her shoe against the floor. She drew a single diagonal mark through one entire expression, eliminating 3 lines of work with one motion. Several students frowned at once. She wrote a substitution beneath it. Clean. Direct. Then another line, shorter still. No hesitation. No erased marks. No pauses to think aloud for effect. Vaughn's smile thinned. She moved to the center of the board and rewrote the constraint in a compact form no one in the room had considered. A student in the front row whispered, "Wait." Another answered, "That cannot be allowed." But it was allowed. Everyone could see it. Evelyn simplified the remaining terms with 2 quick strokes, then boxed the final result. She set the chalk on the tray and stepped back. The clock above the doors read 17 seconds. No one moved. Even the students who had been recording lowered their phones without realizing it. Vaughn stared at the board, then at the clock, then back at the board. His expression did not collapse all at once. It tightened in stages. First confusion, then calculation, then something far more painful to a proud man than anger. Doubt. He crossed the stage quickly and examined each line. He checked the substitution. Correct. He checked the transformed constraint. Correct. He checked the final simplification twice, then a third time. Still correct. A murmur began near the front row and spread outward. Not loud, not chaotic, just the sound of certainty changing shape. One of the doctoral candidates who had spent weeks on the same problem slowly stood up. He did not clap yet. He simply remained standing, eyes fixed on the board. Professor Vaughn straightened and reached for authority the way drowning men reached for air. There are many ways to arrive at an answer, he said, though his voice lacked its earlier polish. Efficiency is not always elegance. Evelyn looked at him kindly, which somehow hurt more than mockery would have. True, she said, but unnecessary complexity is not elegance either. The words landed softly and struck hard. Hey! Visiting professor near the aisle began applauding first, 3 measured claps that sounded like a verdict. Others joined, then more. Within seconds the auditorium filled with applause that no one had planned to give. Vaughn did not clap. He stood beside his own equation like a man locked outside his own house. Evelyn picked up her notebook and turned to leave the stage. Then a student from the second row called out what everyone suddenly wanted to know. Who are you? She paused near the steps, but did not turn around immediately. When she finally did, her eyes moved across the room with the quiet patience of someone who had once belonged there and remembered the cost. My name is Evelyn Carter, she said. Years ago, this university knew it very well. The applause continued longer than anyone expected, not because the audience enjoyed spectacle, but because they had just watched certainty collapse in real time. Evelyn Carter stood near the stage steps with her notebook tucked beneath one arm, as calm as she had been when she entered. Professor Vaughn remained beside the board, jaw set, eyes fixed on the elegant solution that had reduced months of academic pride to 17 seconds of chalk. The students who had laughed first were now the ones looking down at their desks. A young woman in the front row slowly raised her hand, then lowered it again, unsure whether the old rules of the room still applied. Evelyn's words lingered over them all. Years ago, this university knew it very well. Murmurs spread through the auditorium like ripples across still water. Some searched their memories. Others searched online, fingers moving quickly across glowing screens. Then one doctoral student near the center aisle froze mid-scroll. His eyes widened. He stood so abruptly his chair rolled backward a few inches. Professor, he said, voice unsteady, there was a Carter Fellowship in the mathematics department 15 years ago. Another student turned his laptop around. On the screen was an archived faculty page, grainy with age. A younger woman smiled from the photo, wearing a graduation robe and holding an award plaque. Beneath it were the words, Evelyn Carter, youngest recipient of the Northbridge Medal for Theoretical Innovation. The room went silent all over again. Vaughn looked at the screen, then at the woman near the stairs. For the first time that morning, he seemed smaller than his tailored suit. That is impossible, he said quietly. She left before doctoral review. She disappeared. Evelyn answered without bitterness. Some people leave when they realize brilliance is admired more than humanity. The sentence struck deeper than any insult could have. A visiting professor rose from her seat. Dr. Marianne Holt from Stanford, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, stepped into the aisle with unmistakable recognition. Evelyn Carter, she said, almost laughing in disbelief. You wrote the compression model everyone still cites under the initials EC because no one could find you. Several heads snapped toward Evelyn again. One student whispered, that paper changed my entire thesis. Another muttered, we thought the author was a team of researchers. Evelyn gave a small smile. It was just me and a lot of coffee. Laughter broke out, but this time it carried admiration instead of cruelty. Vaughn tried to recover ground. If you were truly who they claim, why return now like this? Why sit in the back pretending to be no one? Evelyn looked at him steadily. Because I wanted to know whether this place had changed. The answer stood all around them. No one breathed for a moment. Students who had mocked her now stared at the floor. Those who had remained silent looked equally ashamed. Vaughn opened his mouth, then closed it again. His greatest talent had always been speaking from authority. But authority is fragile when truth enters the room. Evelyn stepped down the last stair and began walking toward the exit. A student hurried to the aisle. Wait, please. Why did you leave mathematics? She paused, hand resting lightly on the auditorium door. My husband became ill, she said. Then my mother needed care. Then life asked more of me than equations did. I never stopped loving math. I simply loved people first. Several students blinked back tears they did not expect in a lecture hall. Even Dr. Holt lowered her gaze for a moment. Evelyn opened the door, sunlight spilling around her silhouette. Before she stepped through, she turned once more toward the stunned room. Talent can impress people, she said softly. Character teaches them. Then she walked into the bright October morning, leaving behind a board full of symbols and a hall full of people who would never again confuse appearance with worth. The auditorium remained frozen long after the door closed behind Evelyn Carter. Sunlight still stretched across the floor where she had stood, but the room felt darker somehow, as if arrogance itself had dimmed the lights. No one rushed to speak first. No one wanted to be remembered as the next person to say the wrong thing. Professor Vaughn turned slowly toward the board, facing the elegant proof that now seemed less like mathematics and more like judgment written in chalk. He reached for the eraser, then stopped. His hand lowered. For the first time in years, he did not know how to erase what had happened. Students began gathering their bags in silence. The laughter from earlier felt impossible now, like something performed by strangers. A young man from the back row, the same one who had mocked Evelyn's notebook, stared at his desk with flushed cheeks. He finally stood and walked to the stage. "Professor," he said quietly, "I would like to apologize for how I acted." Vaughn looked at him, surprised. The student continued, though his voice shook. "Not just to her. To everyone I judged because they did not look like they belonged here." He turned and walked out before anyone could answer. His honesty moved through the room faster than embarrassment ever had. One by one, students closed laptops and followed. Some stopped to look again at the proof before leaving, as though hoping humility might be learned by proximity. Dr. Marianne Holt remained seated near the aisle. She watched Vaughn for a long moment before speaking. "Brilliant people can teach equations, Richard. Only wise people teach dignity." Then she rose and left him alone with the board. By noon, the story had spread across campus. In the library, students whispered about the woman in the cardigan who solved Vaughn's challenge in 17 seconds. In the engineering building, someone printed the archived photo of young Evelyn Carter and taped it beside a bulletin board with the words "Legends return quietly." In the student union, people debated whether Vaughn would resign, apologize, or pretend nothing had happened. But in a modest brick house 10 miles from campus, none of that noise mattered. Evelyn stood in a sunny kitchen slicing apples into neat pieces. A kettle whistled softly on the stove. Across the table sat her mother, silver-haired and warm-eyed, wrapped in a blue sweater. "How was your lecture?" her mother asked. Evelyn smiled faintly. "Educational." Her mother laughed the way only family can laugh, with love and complete understanding. "Did they recognize you this time?" "Eventually." Tea was poured, apple slices arranged. Outside, leaves drifted across the yard in shades of amber and gold. Evelyn had once believed life would be built from awards, journals, and conference stages. Instead, it had become hospital rooms, caregiving schedules, grocery lists, and quiet mornings like this. And somehow, she thought, it had become richer. That afternoon, a car pulled into the driveway. Professor Vaughn stepped out alone, carrying no briefcase, no polished authority, only a small envelope in one hand. Evelyn opened the door before he reached it. He looked older than he had that morning. "I came to apologize," he said. "Not because the university will expect it, because I should have known better long ago." Evelyn studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Real apologies do not need speeches," she said. "They need change." He lowered his eyes. "I understand." He handed her the envelope. Inside was a formal invitation offering her the endowed chair of mathematics, a position many had competed for. Evelyn glanced at it, then gently returned it. "There are younger minds who need that room more than I do, but I will consider teaching one class." Vaughn looked up, surprised. "What class?" Evelyn smiled toward the autumn light. "Introduction to Assumptions." He laughed despite himself, the first honest laugh anyone had heard from him in years. And on that quiet street, Pride finally learned what Brilliance had known all along. The following Monday, Northbridge University had never seen a line like the one outside room 214. It wrapped down the hallway, curved past the stairwell, and reached nearly to the student center entrance. Business majors stood beside engineers. Literature students held notebooks beside doctoral candidates in physics. Even faculty members lingered at the back pretending they were only passing by. Word had spread that Evelyn Carter would teach her first and only elective of the semester. The title printed on the course catalog was simple enough to confuse everyone. Introduction to Assumptions. At exactly 9:05, the classroom door opened. Evelyn stood there in the same gray cardigan, holding a stack of plain paper folders. No dramatic entrance. No assistant. No display of status. She looked at the crowded hallway and smiled gently. "If you are here only because of the story from last week," she said, "this class may disappoint you. If you are here to think differently, please come in." Not one person left. Students filled every seat, then lined the walls, then sat cross-legged on the floor. Professor Vaughn entered quietly and took a chair in the back row without announcement. A few students noticed him and exchanged glances, but he said nothing. Evelyn placed a single glass jar on the desk at the front of the room. Inside were smooth river stones, marbles, and grains of sand layered together. She wrote one question on the board. "What did you assume before entering this room?" Pens moved immediately. Some wrote that they expected genius to look intimidating. Others admitted they expected an older professor, a famous speaker, or a difficult exam. One student wrote, "I assumed kindness and intelligence rarely arrive together." Evelyn read several responses aloud without names. Then she nodded. "Most mistakes in mathematics begin with bad assumptions," she said. "Most mistakes in life begin the same way." The room became still in that deep way only true attention can create. She lifted the jar. "If I told you this jar is full, some of you would agree because there is no visible space left." She poured the contents into a tray, then placed the large stones back first. Next came the marbles, which rolled into the open gaps. Then the sand, which filled what remained. "Yet now it holds more," she said. "Many people judge capacity by what they see first." People included. Vaughn lowered his eyes in the back row. Evelyn continued through the morning without mentioning formulas once, yet everyone felt they were learning something more precise than numbers. She paired strangers and asked them to list assumptions they made in 1 minute simply by appearance. Then she had each person introduce themselves fully. A football player turned out to be a concert pianist. A quiet woman in scrubs was raising 3 younger siblings while finishing nursing school. A sharply dressed man admitted he had been sleeping in his car for 2 months while keeping a scholarship alive. Every reveal softened the room. By 10:30, no one sat with the same posture they had entered with. Near the end of class, a student raised his hand. "Miss Carter, if assumptions are so dangerous, how do we stop making them?" Evelyn smiled. "You probably never stop completely. The mind is fast, but character can be trained to pause. Ask one more question. Listen 10 seconds longer. Stay curious instead of certain." She erased the board and wrote a final sentence in clean white chalk. "Intelligence notices patterns. Wisdom questions them." No one moved to pack up when class ended. Even the hallway outside was silent. Professor Vaughn stood last. He approached the front desk after the room had emptied. "I have taught here 22 years, he said quietly. "Today was the first time I saw students become better people before becoming better scholars." Evelyn gathered her folders. "Then perhaps today was mathematics after all." He gave a small nod, the kind pride once prevented. Outside, bells rang across campus as students stepped into the bright fall air carrying no homework, yet somehow burdened with more truth than ever before. By the 3rd week, Introduction to Assumptions had become the most talked about class Northbridge University had seen in decades. Not because it was easy, not because it guaranteed better grades. Students spoke about it because people walked in one way and left another. Conversations in hallways changed. Group projects became less hostile. Professors noticed students listening longer before interrupting. Even the campus coffee shop seemed quieter in the best sense, as if everyone had become slightly more aware that strangers carried stories no one could see. Evelyn Carter never mentioned the attention. She arrived each Monday at 9:05, carrying her plain folders and a thermos of tea. She never used slides. She never listed achievements. She never once reminded anyone that she had solved the challenge that made her famous again. Her authority came from something rarer than credentials. It came from consistency. On a gray November morning, she entered room 214 and found every seat filled as usual. But one desk near the window remained empty. It belonged to Jason Miller, the student who had first laughed at her notebook in the auditorium weeks earlier. Since then, he had never missed class. He often arrived early and stayed late, asking thoughtful questions no one expected from the same young man who once mistook arrogance for confidence. Evelyn noticed the empty seat but said nothing. She began class by placing a stack of index cards on each desk. Today, she said, write one assumption people make about you that is false. Then write one assumption you make about yourself that may also be false. The room shifted uneasily. This was harder than solving equations. Pens moved slower than usual. Some students stared at blank cards for several minutes. One by one, volunteers read their first answers aloud. People assume I am lazy because I am quiet. People assume I am rich because of my clothes. People assume I am weak because I cry easily. Then came the second answers, and the room changed again. I assume I will always fail under pressure. I assume I am not leadership material. I assume I am too late to become who I wanted to be. Evelyn listened without interruption. Then the classroom door opened. Jason stepped in, breathless, coat damp from rain. Every head turned. He never interrupted class. I am sorry, he said, voice shaking. My father had a hearing this morning. I had to go with him. He stopped when he realized how red his eyes were. Evelyn simply nodded. Toward the empty seat. We are glad you are here, she said. No embarrassment. No lecture. Just welcome. Jason sat down slowly, fighting emotion. After class ended, most students lingered near the hallway as usual, but Jason remained seated. When the room emptied, he approached Evelyn's desk. My father lost his job last year, he said quietly. We have been pretending everything is normal. Today was about our house. We may lose it by Christmas. Evelyn listened the way few people do, without rushing to solve what pain needed to say first. Jason swallowed hard. I used to make fun of people because it felt better than being scared. I think I became the kind of person I hated. Evelyn folded her hands. Fear often wears the costume of cruelty, she said. The good news is costumes can be removed. He looked down. I cannot fix everything. Start with one thing, she replied. Apologize where you can. Serve where you can. Study honestly. Be the person pain tried to prevent. Jason nodded, tears falling freely now. He thanked her and left. From the back of the room, Professor Vaughn stepped forward. He had heard everything. I would have told him to work harder, he admitted quietly. Evelyn gathered her folders. Effort matters, she said. But people bloom faster when watered than when judged. Vaughn looked at the rain against the windows, then back at the empty room, transformed week after week by a woman he once dismissed. Some lessons arrive late, he said. Evelyn offered a gentle smile. Late is still on time if you choose to learn. December arrived with early snow and the kind of cold that made the old campus buildings groan at night. Northbridge University hung wreaths on iron gates, strung lights across stone arches, and pretended finals season was festive. Yet the warmest room on campus every Monday remained room 214. Students still lined up before sunrise for seats in Evelyn Carter's class, carrying coffee cups, heavy coats, and questions larger than any textbook could answer. On the final session before winter break, they entered to find no folders on the desks and no writing on the board. Instead, a sealed envelope rested at every seat. Curiosity filled the room before Evelyn even arrived. At 9:05, she stepped inside, snowflakes melting on the shoulders of her gray cardigan. Professor Vaughn followed quietly and took his place in the back as he always did now. Evelyn looked around the packed classroom and smiled. Today, she said, there will be no lecture. Open your envelopes. Paper rustled in every corner. Inside each envelope was a handwritten letter. Some students read silently. Others gasped softly. Several covered their mouths. Every letter was personal. Evelyn had written to each student individually over the semester, noticing strengths they had not recognized in themselves. To the shy engineering student, she wrote that clarity was a form of leadership. To the exhausted nursing student, she wrote that compassion under pressure was rare strength. To the football player who played piano in secret, she wrote that tenderness was not weakness. To Jason Miller, she wrote only one sentence at the top before the rest of the page. The man you are becoming is more important than the boy you were. Jason lowered his head and wept openly. No one laughed. No one looked away. Tears had become safe in that room. A young woman near the window raised her hand. How did you know all this about us? Evelyn answered simply. I listened when others waited to speak. The room went silent in the purest way, not from shock this time, but from recognition. How many lives, they wondered, had changed because one person truly paid attention? Evelyn then walked to the board and wrote a final assignment. Give someone else the dignity you once needed. That is all. Students copied the sentence as if it were sacred text. Then something unexpected happened. Professor Vaughn stood from the back row and walked slowly to the front. His polished confidence had long since been replaced by something steadier. Humility fit him better. He turned to face the students. I owe all of you an apology, he said. For years I taught excellence without kindness, rigor without grace, knowledge without wisdom. I thought intelligence made me superior. It only made me educated. The room remained still. Some students had never heard a professor admit fault publicly. Vaughn turned to Evelyn. And I owe you the largest apology of all. I mistook simplicity for smallness. She met his eyes kindly. Then let today be larger than yesterday, she said. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When class ended, no one rushed for the door. Students formed a quiet line instead, each waiting to thank her, shake her hand, or simply stand near the person who had helped them see themselves more clearly. Outside, snow fell in soft white sheets across the campus lawns. Jason was last in line. He handed Evelyn a folded paper. What is this? She asked. My transfer application, he said, to the state university near home. I need to help my family, but I am applying to their night program too. I am not quitting anymore. Evelyn smiled. Good. Responsibility and ambition can share the same house. He laughed through tears. As the room emptied, the board still held the final assignment in bright white chalk. And all across campus that winter, people began completing it. Spring returned slowly to Northbridge University. Snowbanks melted into shining sidewalks. Trees along the quad pushed out fresh green leaves, and students walked with the lighter steps that come when a hard winter has passed. Yet months after the semester ended, Room 214 was still spoken of in the present tense, as though what happened there had never truly concluded. The sentence Evelyn Carter wrote on the board had traveled farther than any official curriculum. Give someone else the dignity you once needed. It appeared on dorm room mirrors, notebook covers, coffee shop chalkboards, and pinned above desks in faculty offices. Some lessons refused to stay in classrooms. Jason Miller became one of those lessons. He transferred to the state university near home, worked evenings at a grocery store, and spent mornings helping his father rebuild a small bookkeeping business from their dining room table. It was not glamorous work. It was honest work. Every Sunday night, he sent Evelyn a short email with one thing he had learned that week. Sometimes it was about accounting. Sometimes it was about patience. Sometimes it was simply, I did not quit today. She answered every message with one line and never more than needed. Growth enjoys quiet company. Across campus, Professor Vaughn changed in ways no committee could have required. He removed his framed magazine covers from his office wall and replaced them with student research posters. He began opening lectures by asking questions instead of displaying credentials. When students made mistakes, he no longer sharpened himself against them. He taught rigor with respect and discovered that excellence listened better when fear left the room. Younger faculty noticed. Older faculty were startled. One afternoon, the dean visited his class unannounced and stayed the entire hour. When it ended, she said only this: Whatever happened to you, keep happening. Vaughn smiled because he knew exactly what had happened. In late April, Northbridge held its annual academic awards ceremony in the Grand Hall with marble columns and polished brass lights. Families filled the seats. Cameras flashed. Names were read. Medals were pinned. Near the end, the dean approached the podium with an extra envelope in hand. Before our final award, she said, we wish to recognize someone who reminded this institution what education is for. A hush fell over the hall. Evelyn Carter, seated quietly beside her mother in the third row, looked genuinely surprised. She wore the same gray cardigan. The dean continued. Some teach subjects. Some teach people. Rarely does one person do both so well. Please join us. The applause began before Evelyn stood and swelled until the hall itself seemed to ring. She walked to the stage with the same calm steps she had taken months earlier toward a blackboard and a trap. This time no trap waited, only gratitude. The dean handed her a small crystal plaque engraved with 4 words. Wisdom through humility. When offered the microphone, Evelyn looked out at students, professors, parents, and at Professor Vaughn standing to applaud with everyone else. She could have spoken about genius, sacrifice, regret, or second chances. Instead, she said something smaller and therefore greater. The smartest person in a room is not always the one speaking. Sometimes it is the one learning. Then she thanked the janitorial staff by name for preparing the hall, thanked the catering workers for the meal no one had yet noticed, kissed her mother on the forehead as she returned to her seat, and ended the evening without trying to own it. Outside, twilight settled over campus in gold and blue. Students lingered on the steps, talking softly. Parents hugged their children longer than usual. Vaughn stood alone for a moment beneath the stone archway, watching Evelyn help her mother into the car. He remembered the woman he had once dismissed in the back row and the person she revealed in everyone afterward. Pride can fill a room quickly, he thought, but dignity stays after it leaves. And that year, Northbridge University finally learned the difference.